There's a version of this story where I stay in my lane, where I accept the explanation I was given, file it under complicated family stuff, and walk down the aisle in October not knowing what I know now. That version was available to me. A lot of people take it. I understand why. I didn't. What I found on a Tuesday afternoon in late July, sitting in my truck in the parking lot of a Publix in Alpharetta, Georgia, watching my future mother-in-law load groceries into her car with no visible difficulty, no cane, no sign of the debilitating hip condition that had supposedly made travel impossible. That image didn't make me angry right away. It made me very, very quiet. And I've learned over the years that when I go quiet like that, something is being rearranged inside me, and I won't know what it is until later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. This one takes a while to tell right, and I want you with me for all of it. My name is Brent Calloway. In the spring of last year, I was 43 years old, a structural engineer with 16 years at a mid-sized civil firm in Duluth, Georgia, a man who spent his working life calculating load-bearing tolerances and figuring out how much weight a thing could hold before it failed. That training turned out to be more relevant to my personal life than I ever expected. Her name was June Alderman, 39, a speech-language pathologist who ran her own private practice out of an office in Suwanee. I want to tell you about June the way I knew her before any of this, because none of what follows makes sense without understanding who she was when things were good. She was methodical in a way that matched something in me. She kept a whiteboard in her kitchen where she mapped out her week in dry erase marker, color-coded by category, and she actually stuck to it, which I found more attractive than I probably should have. She had a laugh that started slow and then caught like kindling. She brought me soup once when I had the flu, drove 40 minutes each way without being asked, and when I thanked her, she just said, "That's what people do." She made me feel like I'd been doing regular things wrong my whole life, and she was gently, affectionately showing me the right way. We met at a continuing education seminar downtown. Different fields, same building, same bad coffee in the lobby. She made a comment under her breath about the ratio of PowerPoint slides to actual information, and I laughed before I could stop myself, and she looked at me like she'd been expecting me. We dated for 14 months before I proposed. I did it on the back porch of the house we'd started talking about buying together, because I wanted the place where we'd begin to be a place that already felt like us. She said yes before I finished asking. I want to be precise about when things started to feel off, because precision is the thing I trust when I'm trying to reconstruct something I missed. It was a Saturday in April, about 3 weeks after the engagement. We were at dinner with my sister Holly and her husband at a Thai place in Brookhaven, just the four of us celebrating, and Holly asked June when she'd get to meet her parents. June smiled and said, "Oh, they're homebodies. We'll figure something out." Holly glanced at me just quickly enough that I caught it, and I filed it away. Her parents were Harlan and Brent Alderman, both in their early 70s, retired, living in Alpharetta in a house where June had grown up. From what I knew, and I want to be honest about how little that was, June had described them as set in their ways. She called them once a week, usually on Sunday evenings, usually from the other room. She'd told me early on that she and her mother had a complicated history, that Brent had strong opinions, and June had spent a lot of her adulthood managing around them. I had accepted this without pushing. I had a complicated relationship with my own father for a decade after my parents' divorce, and I knew how much energy it took to explain that to people who hadn't lived it. But here's the thing about accepting something without pushing. You still notice. You just don't say anything about what you notice. As the wedding took shape over April and May, we'd set the date for October 11th, a venue in Roswell we'd both loved immediately. June's position on her parents became more specific and more fixed. We were sitting at the kitchen table one evening in early May, going through the guest list, and I raised it plainly. "I'd really like your parents to be there, June." She set her pen down. "My mother's hip has been bad. Travel is really hard for her. They're in Alpharetta. That's 30 minutes. You know what I mean. Events like this are a lot for her. The noise, the standing around. It takes a lot out of her. Then we seat her right up front, and she doesn't have to stand at all." June looked at the table. "I just don't want to make this about managing their limitations, Brent. I want us to have a day that feels good." I let it go. I'm not proud of that, but I understood something about protecting people you love from having to explain themselves in public, and I told myself that's what this was. June protecting me from a difficult dynamic she'd spent years navigating. But the hip detail stuck with me. It stuck the same way a miscalculation sticks when you're reviewing structural drawings, not screaming at you, just sitting there slightly wrong, waiting to be noticed again. June's mother had a bad hip. They lived 30 minutes away. Big events were hard on her. These were the facts as I had been given them. I am an engineer. I don't dismiss facts. But I also know that a set of facts can describe a structure that shouldn't be able to stand. Over the following weeks, I watched carefully. Not obviously, not with any change in my behavior, just with the quiet attention that's become second nature to me after 16 years of looking at things and figuring out where the load is being distributed wrong. I noticed June took her Sunday calls in the bedroom now, with the door pulled almost shut. I noticed that when she mentioned her parents, it was always in the context of limitation. What they couldn't do, what was too much for them. I noticed that she never mentioned what they were looking forward to. Happy people mention what they're looking forward to. I had one concrete piece of information about Harlan and Bette Alderman beyond what June had told me. Their address, which I'd seen on a card June had received from them at Christmas, and the fact that they were both apparently in good enough health to maintain a vegetable garden, which June had mentioned once, almost offhandedly, while we were talking about tomatoes at a farmer's market. A bad hip can be a lot of things. Sometimes it's someone who genuinely can't travel 30 minutes to her daughter's wedding. Sometimes it's a reason someone needed to give. On the afternoon of Tuesday, July 22nd, I left work an hour early and drove north on GA 400. 34 minutes. That's how long it took me to get from our office in Duluth to the Publix shopping center in Alpharetta, half a mile from the Alderman Street, which I'd looked up beforehand. I want to be clear about what I was doing and what I wasn't doing. I wasn't there to confront anyone. I'm not built that way, and it wouldn't have served anything. I was there because I needed to understand the shape of what I was walking into, and I couldn't do that from inside the story I'd been given. I sat in my truck with a coffee and I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 22 minutes. A silver Honda Pilot pulled into the lot and parked 4 spaces from me, and a woman got out. Early 70s, short white hair, carrying a reusable bag over each arm, moving through the parking lot with the steady, purposeful stride of someone who walked like that every day and had for years. No cane, no limp, no visible sign of anything that would make a short car ride to her daughter's wedding an act of physical hardship. I recognized her from a photograph I'd seen once in June's phone, a family photo from several years ago, Harlan and Bette at what looked like a 4th of July gathering, both of them smiling in lawn chairs. This was the same woman, older, but the same. Bette Alderman loaded her groceries into the car, returned her cart, and drove away. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after she left. I am a man who works in facts and tolerances, and I had just acquired a new fact that did not fit the load-bearing structure of the explanation I'd been given. I didn't say anything to June that week. I know that may be hard to understand, but I needed to think, and I have learned slowly, through some costly mistakes, that acting before you understand the full picture is how you create damage that can't be undone. So I thought. I sat with the thing I'd seen and I asked myself the question I'd been carefully not asking. What was Bette Alderman's hip not the reason for? And underneath that question was a harder one. Was June keeping her parents away from me, or was she keeping me away from her parents? Those are different problems. And the answer to which one it was mattered more than almost anything I could think of. On Saturday, July 26th, I told June I was heading into the office to review drawings for a project going to bid on Monday. I kissed her goodbye at 8 in the morning, got in my truck and drove north. This time I knocked on the door. I had thought about it carefully. I am not an impulsive person. Impulsive people cause structural failures. I had decided that whatever I found was not going there to make anyone feel cornered or attacked. I was going to introduce myself to the people who were supposed to be my family in 4 months, and let whatever was true come to the surface on its own. The house was a 2-story brick colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac, well-kept flower boxes under the front windows. A vegetable garden along the left side of the yard, just like June had mentioned, tomatoes. Zucchini, the kind of garden that takes sustained physical effort to maintain. Harlan Alderman answered the door. He was a compact man in his early 70s, gray and neatly dressed, with the cautious evaluating eyes of someone who'd spent a career. Insurance, I'd later learn, 30 years as an underwriter, sizing up risk. He looked at me without speaking for a long moment. Mr. Alderman. I kept my voice even. My name is Brent Calloway. I'm engaged to your daughter, June. I apologize for showing up unannounced, but I think it's past time we met. The silence that followed told me something. It wasn't the silence of a man who didn't know who I was. It was the silence of a man who had known this moment was coming and had not fully decided how to handle it. "Harlan," Bennett's voice came from inside. "Who's at the door?" He didn't answer her immediately. He looked at me, at my face, at my truck in the driveway, back at my face. And then he stepped back and let me in. "I want to tell you about that house, because details have always mattered to me." It was orderly and warm, the kind of house where things had been in the same places for 20 years, and everyone knew where everything was. Family photographs on the stairwell wall, a dining room table with a good tablecloth on it, books on the shelves that had been read. This was not the house of people in crisis or dysfunction. This was the house of people who'd built a stable life and were comfortable in it. There was no obvious reason, standing in their foyer, for them to have been kept out of their daughter's engagement. Bette came in from the kitchen. She was exactly the woman from the parking lot 4 days ago. She looked at me and I watched recognition cross her face. She knew my name, I was nearly certain of it, before a careful neutrality settled over her expression. "Mrs. Alderman," I said. "Brent Calloway. I'm going to marry your daughter, and I'd very much like to understand why she hasn't been able to bring herself to introduce us." To her credit, Bette didn't flinch. She looked at her husband, who had moved into the room behind me, and something passed between them that I couldn't fully read but recognized as a long-married shorthand, the silent negotiation of who was going to speak first. It was Harlan who started, not easily, but he started. "Sit down," he said. We sat in the living room, me on one end of the couch, Bette in the armchair, Harlan on the up of the couch with 6 feet of careful space between us. And the next hour was the most revealing conversation of my life, including 17 years of marriage to my first wife. It came out the way things come out when people haven't rehearsed, but have been living with something long enough that it's organized itself into shape. Not one clean confession, but an accumulation of pieces, each one clarifying the one before it. They had known about me for nearly a year. June had told them she was seeing someone, had been seeing him for a while, was serious about him. She had described me, my work, my general character, but it became apparent, deliberately incomplete about certain specifics. When she had finally told them she was engaged, the conversation had not gone the way she hoped. "We expressed concerns," Bette said. "What kind of concerns, Mrs. Alderman?" She looked at her hands. Harlan looked at the window. The silence stretched in a way that told me with absolute clarity that I was not going to like the answer. "We have a certain picture," Harlan said finally, "of the kind of life June was going to have, the kind of family she'd be part of." "Meaning what exactly?" He was quiet for a moment. "Meaning we had ideas about who she'd end up with, what that would look like." I'm going to be honest with you about what I heard in that room, because I think the honest version is the only version worth telling. They never said anything overtly ugly. People like Harlan and Bette Alderman rarely do. What they said was careful and hedged and dressed up in words like different backgrounds, and lifestyle expectations, and what we envisioned. What they meant, what sat underneath every word they said like the actual load-bearing element of a structure everyone's pretending is decorative, was that they had expected their daughter to marry someone who looked more like them, who'd grown up more like them, who lived in a certain set of neighborhoods and attended a certain kind of church and had a certain set of references that would have made every family gathering feel familiar and uncomplicated. I am a black man from Southwest Atlanta. I have a degree from Georgia Tech and a professional license and a business card that says Senior Project Engineer. I have built bridges and parking decks and mixed-use developments that tens of thousands of people use without ever thinking about the person who calculated whether they'd hold. None of that had shown up anywhere in the picture Harlan and Bette Alderman had painted of their daughter's future. I sat with that for a moment. I let it settle into the structure of what I was understanding. Then I said, "June has known about your concerns since when exactly?" Bette looked at Harlan. "Since the fall," Harlan said. "When she told us she was serious about you. And the engagement. She called us in March. We'd gotten engaged in February. She had known from the moment she said yes that her parents had a problem with who I was. She had put on the ring knowing that. I thanked them for their time. I meant it. I am not a man who withholds honesty even when the situation makes it difficult. And I told them plainly before I stood up that I intended to marry their daughter regardless of this conversation, and that I hoped they would find their way to something better than what they were currently sitting in. Not for my sake, but for June's. Harlan walked me to the door. He shook my hand on the porch, and I don't know exactly what was in that handshake, but it was something acknowledgement, maybe, or the beginning of it. June was home when I got back. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop and a Saturday afternoon quiet around her, and she looked up and smiled, and it lasted exactly 3 seconds before she read something in my face that stopped it. Brent. I sat down across from her. I needed to see her face. I drove up to Alpharetta this morning. I met your parents, June, both of them. Your mother loaded groceries into her car with no trouble at all. I watched the color leave her face. I have seen structural failures in slow motion on video, the moment a thing that seemed solid begins to give way, and it looked like that. She closed the laptop. She set it aside carefully, the way you set something down when you need your hands free. And she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, not in 14 months of dating and 5 months of engagement. It was the look of someone whose most carefully maintained wall has just come down, and who isn't sure yet whether to be relieved or terrified. How long? I asked her. I kept my voice level. I had worked very hard on those 2 words on the drive back. How long have you known that their issue was with me specifically? She didn't look away. I want to give her that. She didn't look away from me. Since October. 8 months before the wedding. 4 months before she said yes. You accepted my ring knowing this. Brent, you planned a wedding with me. You let me think your mother's hip was the reason. You were going to stand up in front of everyone I know and tell them your parents were too frail to drive 30 minutes, and you were never going to tell me the truth. She was crying now. I was working on them. I kept thinking if I gave it more time, if they just saw how serious this was, how good you are. But you didn't tell me you were working on anything. You let me think there was nothing to work on. Because I was ashamed of them. Her voice broke on it. I am so ashamed of where they are on this. It is not where I am, Brent. It is not who I am. I know that. I did know it. I believed it completely. But you made a decision, June. You decided what I deserved to know about something that was directly about me. You managed me, the way you'd manage a problem, not the way you treat someone you've promised to build a life with. I have spent 16 years calculating what structures can hold. And I need to know before we go any further whether this one can. She didn't have an answer for that. And I didn't ask her for one right then. I drove to my older brother's house in Decatur that evening. My brother Philip Calloway is 49, a high school principal, and constitutionally incapable of panic. He's the person I've called in every actual crisis of my adult life, and this qualified. He handed me a beer on his back porch and let me talk until I ran out of words, which took a while. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. She loves you, he said. I know. And she's been sitting in the middle of something she didn't know how to carry to you. That part's real too. She should have told me. Yeah, he said. She should have. And she knows that. Question is whether you think there's something worth salvaging on the other side of that mistake. I didn't answer him right away. We sat there in the July heat with our beers and the cicadas going in the trees behind his yard, and I thought about what I actually believed about June, not what I was feeling in that moment, which was a complicated tangle of anger and grief, but what I actually knew to be true about the person she was on every ordinary day. She was someone who showed up. For her clients, for me, for the people in her life. She was someone who noticed things and did something about them without waiting to be asked. She was someone who had been carrying a weight she thought she was protecting me from, which was the wrong call, but which I could also, if I was honest, understand the architecture of. Shame makes people construct things, not because they're deceitful, but because the truth feels too heavy to hand someone else, and they convince themselves they'll handle it before it becomes a problem. And sometimes they run out of time. June called me 3 times that night. I didn't answer. I needed one night without managing the feelings of anyone other than myself, and I knew that if I picked up, I would spend the next 2 hours managing hers. I listened to the voicemails in the morning in Philip's driveway with my coffee. The first one was ragged and apologetic, the kind of message that's really just someone trying to find a foothold while the ground is moving under them. I'm sorry repeated in different registers until she ran out of breath. The second one was different, quieter, the kind of voice a person has after they've cried everything out and gotten very clear. I called my parents tonight, she said. I told them that what they've said, what they've believed about you, is not something I'm willing to apologize for or explain away anymore. I told them that if they want to be part of my life, part of our life, they need to be willing to actually know you, not what they assumed about you. You. A pause. I also told them that if they can't come to our wedding and treat my fiancé with basic respect and basic decency, I'll be at that wedding without them, and the hole that leaves is on them. Another pause. Longer. I should have said that in October, I know that. I don't have a good enough excuse. I just need you to know it's done. I played that voicemail twice. Then I drove back to Suwannee. What happened over the weeks that followed was not a clean recovery, and I want to be honest about that, because I've heard enough tidy versions of hard stories to know they don't do anyone any good. June and I had 3 conversations in August that I would describe as the most difficult of my life, and I've been through a divorce. At least a divorce has lawyers and paperwork. This was just 2 people in a kitchen, and everything out in the open with no procedural structure to hold on to. I told her clearly, more than once, that the issue was not her parents' beliefs, which she had not chosen and could not control. The issue was the months of managed silence, the engineered explanations. The decision, made unilaterally, that I didn't need to know something that was fundamentally about my own dignity. She heard it. That's the thing I want you to understand. She actually heard it, which is different from the thing people do where they absorb what you're saying and convert it immediately into something about their own feelings. She sat with it. She went quiet. She went to see a therapist, not as a gesture toward me, not as something she announced and wanted credit for, but something she told me about 2 weeks after she'd started, matter-of-factly, as a thing she'd recognized she needed. She stopped managing. She started telling me the hard things as they came up, instead of 3 months later when they'd become emergencies. I noticed the difference. It's not a small difference. Harlan and Bet did not transform overnight. I want to say that plainly because I think these stories too often let the people who behaved badly off the hook with one meaningful glance or one tearful dinner. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and less satisfying and more real. Bet called June twice in August. The first call was a continuation of the argument they'd been having since October, now with my visit added to it. The second call was something else. June described it to me as her mother saying less than she usually would, listening more than she usually would, in the way of someone who was sitting with an image of themselves they didn't recognize. Harlan said almost nothing in any of the conversations June reported to me. June told me that silence from him meant something specific, that he was moving through something internal that hadn't resolved yet, and I chose to take that at face value. I met them for dinner in September. A restaurant in Johns Creek. June picked it. Neutral ground, good lighting, the kind of place where the noise level requires just enough effort to hear each other that you can't let the conversation get too far from the surface. Smart choice. She'd thought about it. Harlan got there first. He was already seated when June and I walked in, and he stood up when he saw us, and there was a moment, just a second or two, where we looked at each other across the table, and there was something in it I recognized. Not friendship, not yet. Something more like 2 people who'd been studying the same structure from different sides, and had both come to understand they weren't going anywhere. He shook my hand first. He didn't wait for me to extend mine. Bet arrived 2 minutes later. She sat down, put her napkin in her lap, and looked at me with the directness of someone who'd been rehearsing, but not in the nervous way. In the way of someone who'd decided what they needed to say and wanted to say it while they still had the nerve. I want to tell you that what we said, what we implied, what we believed, it was wrong. Her voice was steady. I spent the summer looking at it very hard, and I'm not going to sit here and give you a list of reasons or qualifications. I'm going to tell you it was wrong and that I'm sorry. I understand if that doesn't fix anything tonight, but I needed to say it to your face. I looked at her for a moment. I have cross-referenced the math on enough load-bearing calculations to know when a statement is structurally sound, and that one was. I appreciate that more than I can tell you, I said. And I want you to know that I'm not sitting here carrying anything toward you that I intend to let stand between me and June, but I need you to understand something. I leaned forward slightly. She chose me. She made that choice on her own, with her own values, and I need that to be respected, not managed. Respected. Bet held my gaze. Her chin came up a 1/4 inch. Understood, she said. Harlan nodded once, slowly. He ordered a glass of wine, which I learned later was unusual for him, and I took it as the gesture I think it was. The dinner was not warm, but it was honest, and that's a thing I know how to build on. Philip joined us for dessert. June had arranged it without telling me, and when I saw him walk through the restaurant door in his good jacket, I understood that she was learning how to bring people into the room instead of arranging them around it. Philip sat down, shook everyone's hand, and said, with the particular ease he's had his whole life in rooms where ease is required, "My brother tells me you've had quite a summer. I hope the fall treats you better." Bet Alderman looked at my brother, and something in her face shifted and she said, "It already is, I think." That was enough. For that night, it was enough. We were married on October 11th, as planned. We didn't move the date. June asked me in late August whether I wanted to, whether the date felt tainted by everything that had happened around it. And I told her no, because the date had been built on something real, and everything that came after had tested it and hadn't broken it, and I thought that meant we'd earned it. The ceremony was at the venue in Roswell we'd loved from the beginning. 63 people. Philip standing up front with me, 3 of June's closest friends beside her. My mother, Brent Calloway, 71 years old and sharper than anyone I've ever met, seated in the front row in a blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion and refused to tell anyone the price of. In the third row, on June's side, Harlan and Bet Alderman. Bet sat with her hands folded and her back straight, and the particular attention of a person who understands, perhaps for the first time, the weight and the cost and the meaning of what they're witnessing. June came down the aisle and found my eyes before she found anything else in the room. And I thought about everything. The parking lot in Alpharetta, the morning I knocked on the door, the voicemail at midnight, the dinner in Johns Creek, Philip's back porch, and the cicadas in the July heat. I thought about what it means to really know a person versus what it means to know the version of them that exists when everything is comfortable. The second one is easy. The first one is what you're actually marrying. It's April now as I'm telling you this, 6 months on from October 11th, and I want to close with the thing I've been sitting with since then. There is a version of this story where I found what I found in that Publix parking lot, confirmed it on that Saturday morning in July, and walked away from the whole thing. I think that version was available to me. I think that a lot of people would have taken it and been justified in taking it. There are things that can't be rebuilt, and the people inside a situation are the only ones who know whether this is one of them. What I chose, and why, comes down to this. I chose it because June's parents' failure was not June's failure, even though she had let their failure become her silence, and her silence had become a wall between us that I had to find on my own. I chose it because when the wall came down, it came down because she chose to take it apart, starting with a phone call at midnight that she did not have to make. I chose it because the woman who calls her parents at midnight and tells them their prejudice is not something she will negotiate around. That is a woman who knows what it means to choose someone, who has looked at what choosing someone actually costs and paid it. I'm an engineer. I spend my professional life determining what a structure is actually built of, underneath the finish and the facade, because what it's built of is the only thing that matters when the load gets heavy. By last October, I knew what June was built of, and that was enough for me. If you're holding something back from someone who has earned the right to know it, something true about your life, or your family, or the people standing between you and the life you're trying to build together, I want you to hear this. The person who chose you deserves to stand in the full room with you, not the version of the room you've decided is safe for them. The actual room, with everything that's in it. That's the only foundation that holds. Drop a comment below and tell me what this brought up for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. There's always more story. Thank you for being here.